Today should be a good day, I think. Just arrived at Windhill to meet a guy called David, and he's built his own bike. And this one sounds like it's pretty exciting. So we're gonna hit the trails, go meet David, and have a bit of a ride and see what's up. Certainly better than being in a maintenance set, that's for sure.
Armed.
So it's not every day someone tells you they've made a homemade carbon enduro bike, let alone something that looks like this. Now look at the layout on it. You could say that this looks quite modern, quite contemporary even, looking like a lot of things available on the market at a glance. Raked out 63-degree head angle, and look at that seat angle pushing its way towards 80 degrees there. Really steep, really quite modern. And it's got a very high forward pivot there with an idler wheel, the chain running of course over that pivot point, and then you've got the linkage that drives the shock. So it's a single pivot with a linkage driven shock using the high pivot styling. And just look at the finish on that front triangle there. The front triangle itself is one of the best finishes I've seen on any carbon bikes, let alone the fact that this is a prototype. And of course there isn't any sort of official cable routing. Treat this one as a test mule. But I've got to say, just looking at the thing, I am seriously impressed. So up front is running a massive 180mm travel with 170 on the rear. It's 29-inch wheels, and as you can see, this thing looks like it means business. And this was all made by a guy called Dave Harvey that got in touch with me. So let's meet David. So a minute ago, I was just saying how we were coming to Windhill to check out a homemade bike. This isn't really what I expected. David, how did this happen? Most people's homemade bikes tend to be made of steel or maybe alloy if they're pretty good at welding. This is pretty different.
Yeah, so I mean, I started with a TIG welded frame, a steel frame. It was a frame building course down at Downland Cycles. That's where it all kicked off from, really. So
you clearly got a love of bikes and wanted to make bikes before you'd even got to this.
Yeah.
So let's have a think about this for a minute, right? So this is a carbon fibre. How much travel is this?
So rear 170, front I've got 180 at the moment.
Okay, so it's a big enduro bike,
yeah,
really.
Yeah.
High pivot with an idler wheel on here with a pretty slack head angle, a pretty steep seat angle on there.
Yeah, 63.5 degree head angle, and the seat tube angle I think I had at about 78, so quite steep.
Okay, so you're 6'5". 6'5", yes, yeah. Quite a bit taller than me. So is that how you kind of got to this? Because I don't know about you, but I spent a long time trying to find bikes that fit correctly.
Yeah, I think it's always been a struggle. Every bike I've had, I've always gone for the largest bike, XL size, but I guess as the bike industry's progressed, I've just not felt like it's been big enough. So I've just wanted to try it myself, try and get the geometry right for what I feel is good for me.
Okay, so let's go back to this steel thing for a second. So you've already learned to weld previously. How have you got to making this as your first sort of real bike?
So yeah, I guess
not trying to say a hardtail's not a real bike, but this is a bit different.
But it's all about where I work. I work at a place which makes carbon fibre tooling and components and things. So everything I had around me was what I needed to essentially make this.
So you're pretty much a specialist in working with materials like carbon?
Yeah, I've got a good few years experience now, so about 6 years or so in the industry. So. Okay, right. Now this is starting to make a bit more sense. So we've established that you needed to build a bike that was long enough for you and that, but where did you get the inspiration for sort of the configuration? Because this is like bang up to date, the sort of look of the bike. Yeah, I mean, there's a few bikes out there, obviously all the high pivot ones. So I had a look at the Forbidden, the DV8 Highlander,
yeah.
Also the Commissar Supreme, the new high pivot one they've got.
Yeah.
Because this originated as a downhill frame design, but then last minute I kind of shifted it a bit, given where I live down in the south of the UK. There's not a lot of downhill down there, so yeah, shifted it to a more of an aggressive enduro bike so I could still pedal up hills. Okay, right, so I mean, I'm almost a bit lost for words on where to start with this project. Give us a rough breakdown of the process of how you got to this. I'm guessing you had to sketch some ideas and concepts out of sort of your layout and then use some computer programs to sort of get it in there? Yeah, so I've started on a program called Linkage. essentially put all that geometry into that, had a play with like a pivot design. I guess it's essentially a single pivot linkage driven. And until I got to a point where I was happy with the way the axle path worked, the progressive suspension rate, and just went from there really.
I mean, it's funny you're talking about downhill bikes there like the Supreme. It's incredibly low slung, everything about it. That top tube is really low, and even the shock hardware, everything is just so low down on the bike there. Was that part of your original sort of, your requirements, the things you look for in a bike?
Yeah, I guess I've always liked bikes that have low centre of gravities, like a good low standover height to enable you to sort of move the bike around a lot more. I've always liked that aspect. So that's where I started off with that design, with the top tube goes so low there, and all of the linkage and things is all tucked away down lower in the frame. So
yeah, okay. So and how did you come up with the actual configuration for the linkage? So it's obviously a single pivot with a linkage driving the shocks, like you've referenced, and it's got an idler here to aid with the pedalling there. It's just going to have quite a bit of chain growth with design like that.
Yeah.
What made you actually sort of, how did you get to this?
I started out with a few sketches here and there, trying to get the sort of general concept in my head of what I wanted to do with the pivot, and then I went to the program linkage, and it was all about moving those pivot locations around in that sort of space and looking at the different sort of suspension curves and things that get output from that.
What were the traits that you were looking for from the suspension that I had? Could you decide how you wanted it to feel at this stage?
Yeah, so I mean, I wasn't sure on a lot of the suspension aspects, but I knew that I wanted a rearward axle path and a progressive or relatively progressive force curve.
I've got to say, I don't know if you can see this looking in close, but the finish on the front end of this that's like a production quality bike. That is unreal how you've got that looking. I mean, I can tell, look at the rear triangle swing arm, not rear triangle, you can tell this is still work in progress. So I'm guessing there's been quite a few iterations of the way you've had to make this,
definitely.
modify it on the go. Yeah,
I mean, as you see it now, it's the front triangle is the first and only part I've made out of the tool. The swing arms themselves, that's the
first one.
Yes, first one out.
That's ridiculous to get that as a first go. I know major manufacturers that have done up to 10 layups of a front triangle to try and get that right where they want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's still in testing, but it's pretty good so far.
Okay, so tell us about the process and how it works. So how do you actually make a mould to make a bike like this? It's not you just pop a frame together. It's not like working with metals. I
mean, there's a few different ways. Like one of the ways is machining a tool out of aluminium or steel. In this case, I obviously had help from my workplace. They machined a tooling board, which is effectively a low-cost epoxy-based material. They machined that. It's quick and easy. And then from that, I've made a carbon fibre mould tool encapsulating this design. Essentially, you make two halves, and that gives you your two halves of the frame. And then you lay up into that tool, put it together, and then cook it in an autoclave.
I believe you've got some of those with you.
Yes,
can
we've
we
got
have a
some
look
of those.
at them?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so talk me through what you've got here, because even the manufacturing of these looks extremely complicated.
With these carbon fibre mould tools, these are the tools I've used to make the bike itself. To make these, you had to machine a separate block of material, low density epoxy block.
Yeah.
And then you laminate this tool from that block. So this is just one half of the main frame tool here. And as you can see, I've got all the other loose tools in it.
Yeah. So it's a seat post, I guess. Yeah. That does a great job there.
Yeah, that's it.
And then, so you lay the carbon up on the inside, and then you basically close the mould. How does the inside work? On some of the moulds I've seen previously, I've never seen a carbon mould. I've only seen like steel or alloy moulds.
Yeah.
That are baked in ovens and they're pressurised and stuff. Some of them have bladders and things. Every frame has a different sort of way of coming together.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a few like that as well. And this concept, I guess, the carbon mould isn't always the standard way people go. But at our company, I guess it's the normal for us. So you tend to get more more pulls out of this sort of material than the epoxy board, but then it's less than an aluminium tool, and it can work out cheaper in some methods as well. And then the way I've sort of done this, instead of the internal bagging or bladders like you've seen before, it's essentially an internal core, foam core that I had inside.
Okay.
And the material, essentially, yeah, like you say, you're putting the material into the tool. In a configuration like this, you normally leave one half with the material coming up high, and in the other half you leave the material sort of recessed in.
Okay.
And it almost kind of overlaps and joins together.
Gotcha.
When you put the two halves together.
And then, so I guess you then clamp it together and it gets baked.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, essentially.
To a degree. And what sort of temperatures are we talking about to
so
cure
in
this sort of?
In this case, it was around 120 degrees.
That's much lower than I don't know what I thought it would be, but it's much lower than I thought it would be.
Yeah, I mean, it varies quite a lot with the different materials out there.
Yeah.
You've got really low cure temperatures for tooling carbon like this, and for component carbon, it ranges anything from around 100 to 200 odd degrees in a lot of cases.
Now, tell us a bit about the rear triangle, because you've got some different components around here.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess as you see over here, this is actually the first iteration of swing arm I did essentially. Same finish as the front triangle, but as I found quite quickly after building this bike up with this swing arm, there was just way too much movement in the rear end, too much flex. So I then went on to essentially make the second version here with more material, stiffer material in there.
So is the flex something that you can sort of configure before having to lay up in programs, or is this something you have to just tune by the way that you lay up the carbon?
From my knowledge, I know that there are ways of tuning the flex, and there's ways of doing stress analysis with laminates to try and get that tuned before you make it. But in most cases, like this one, I've had to obviously make it and trial it firsthand.
That's part of the charm. So is this the third iteration of rear triangle?
Yes, that's the third iteration on there at the
Yeah.
moment. Had to extend the profile of the swing arm itself just to try and increase the stiffness.
So where were you getting the flex? Is it at the back end, or is it the front of the frame?
It's from obviously sourced from the wheel, the back end, sort of the movement from side to side. Where it's such a long swing arm, there's quite a lot of leverage on it.
Yeah, sure. What's the chainstay length on that?
It's about 450, I think.
Okay, so it's a good length anyway. So obviously the first iteration had a little bit more flex than you'd like, and you've got to the third now. So how close do you think this is to like what you've been looking for?
I think for a first prototype, first full build, I think it's much closer than I thought it could be, because I mean, so many elements to deal with. It could have gone really wrong.
Yeah.
But
so I mean, it's been quite a long project. So you say you started this in 2018?
Yeah, it was right at the end of 2018, sort of December time. That's when I first asked about if I could actually even do a project like this at my workplace. And yeah, going from there really, I had a concept design and I just kept plugging away.
And this has been done in your own time, I assume, like
yeah.
out of working hours?
Essentially, yeah.
Do you reckon you could put an amount of time on, how much time you spent doing this? Obviously, a few years down the line with the complete bike. But,
it's difficult to say, definitely, because it's just been a lot of late nights, a lot of hours spent at work, out of hours, laminating each part, and the design itself took a long time. Design all the tooling as well. Obviously, I had help from some colleagues at work and guys there, so yeah, much appreciated from those guys, definitely.
So make no mistake, I mean, I've just said how good the front triangle looks on here, and you're on the third version of the rear, but there must have been sort of small hurdles and stuff and side steps you've had to make along the way to try and make things work. What's been the most frustrating?
Yeah, I mean an aspect of that is possibly around the chain line itself.
Yep.
Where I've got the idler pulley ever so slightly further forward, so it does the way it sort of connects with the chain ring isn't as good as I'd hoped.
As in the chain wrap?
Yeah, essentially I need a bit more chain wrap, so it would have been ideal if I could have moved this further back. But at the time, with the linkage software, it was giving me sort of good curves and things that I like to look of. So that's what I went with. It was only until I test rode it that I sort of found that sort of aspect wasn't the best.
Okay, so does that suggest there might be another prototype coming?
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely thought about it. I want to do that. It's just getting there with the design. So obviously I've already thought about what I want to do. I'd want to shorten the rear end. Not the chainstay length, but the swing arm itself, shorten that, bring the pivot maybe not higher, but just further back, so I can get a stiffer, shorter rear end with a better chain line. So,
yeah, sure.
So I've started to look into that at the moment, but it's definitely challenging.
So this is a labour of love, because there's so many bikes around now with probably fairly similar geometry, but probably not ticking off all the boxes of the things that you're looking for. But yeah, you don't do this to save money. I'd imagine that this probably costs you quite a lot more than it would be to buy a bike off the shelf now.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky with where I work and what they let me do. So in that respect, I didn't have to pay too much for certain things like tooling and that sort of side of it, and the material being out of date meant that they weren't going to use it for a job itself anyway, so it was essentially free for me. So that really helped. So the main thing, I only really spent the money on the components that I've put on the bike and on a few small bits that I fitted and had made.
I love it. What a cool project. It sounds like you should be working for a bike company. Is that something that you'd want to do with this sort of level of work?
Yeah, I mean, that was in that essence, that was one of the main drivers for doing this project, was the fact that I've always loved bikes, engineering, the technology, and I just really want to get into a company, into the bike industry, and be a part of the bigger picture.
Well, you never know. Might be a few bike designers watching this video actually to wonder exactly how on earth you made this. Get in touch if you are watching, by the way. Okay, so we found out that well, it's clearly not a cheap process doing something like this, and it's obviously taken a long time, and there must be some frustrations with having to go back and forth, getting the right things sorted on it. But I mean, look at the thing. Look at the fact this is a homemade bike. Let's talk about some of the positives of the bike, because, well, let's face it, you've made your own bike. Yeah,
that's the biggest thing, is the fact that I've made this. It's come out like this. So I'm really chuffed with that aspect. And then I've had a handful of test rides on it so far, and so far it's feeling really good. I can tell the differences between my own bike and the production bike that I've got, the Privateer 161 I've got.
Okay, yeah.
So
that's a pretty modern frame by all accounts.
Yeah.
With geometry on it and stuff as well.
Yeah, so even on that, so I've extended the reach on that bike itself, because in a way the geometry on this has felt, I mean, I've designed it, so I guess it feels better for me, better for my height. And then the suspension feel about this bike as well is not a million miles off that production bike. There's a lot of differences, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But in that sense, I'm quite surprised that it feels that good in that sense.
Yeah. And so what did you say the reach was on this? Was it 530?
530 at the moment, yeah.
It's funny because a few years ago that sounded like monstrously big, but it's a really realistic size for a lot of people. And there's a few brands offering, Bird and Geometron are offering bikes as big as that, and Polo, of course, large bikes. Yeah, so what was the maiden voyage like?
It was quite nerve-wracking, to say the least, that's for sure. I was fully expecting at some aspects, at drops or corners, just to hear a snap or something go, because at the time I didn't have that much faith in my own laminating. But obviously I've got this far down the line. I've had a few test rides at a few local spots, and not pushed it fully yet, but definitely slowly ramping up that feel.
I mean, was your first test ride on your own in the woods where no one could see?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I didn't want anyone to.
I bet it draws a lot of attention from people.
Yeah, I've had a few people who have seen it so far, and some of them haven't really said anything, have just stared at it, didn't know what to say, and then other guys have been like, "Oh, what is that? Like, where's that? Like, what make is that? What brand is that?"
Yeah, what brand? Has it got a name? Has it got anything yet?
At the moment, it doesn't really. I mean, I've had a few names sort of in my head, but nothing that flows off the tongue yet, I don't think.
It's a really good looking bike. I've got to say, I can't believe how nice that finish is on the front end. I think before when we were just talking a minute ago, I said the only other bike I'd seen with a finish that's sort of reminiscent to that is like, I think Uno with some of their frames.
Yeah.
But as far as the raw carbon goes, it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. It's something I really wanted to do. Especially this sort of finish here on the top tube and down tube. I guess a lot of people call it the forged carbon look, which you get in pressed carbon, but in this sense, it's a hand laminated frame. So
yeah, so you had this on the original rear end as well.
Yeah, it was something I wanted to put across the whole bike because I thought it looked. Personally, I think I like the look of that better than a normal sort of twill you get from the carbon weave.
Yeah.
Because it's not as popular and it's not as common in the automotive industry. But
yeah, that's the typical carbon look that people want, but I think that's something special.
Yeah, it's definitely more unique, and that's exactly why I liked it so much.
I tell you what, I literally cannot believe that essentially one person has designed and manufactured this bike. You've achieved, really, I mean, I know it's still a process, I say, but you've achieved what like teams of people do. I think that is outstandanding. I guess you have had some helpers on the way that have helped you out with sourcing parts and that. Anyone you want?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, big thanks to Ian Wilson when he was at Formflex. He's the one who essentially allowed me to do this project. So couldn't have done it without him, basically. So and then obviously my colleagues at work, there's elements like the machining that obviously I didn't know how to do myself. So a lot of help from the machine side, the tooling as well. I had a bit of help while I was laminating that. So yeah, big thanks to all the colleagues at work. They had great help, and Formflex itself, I guess. Yeah, really good.
I think this is an amazing project, and I can't wait to see what you do next. It'd be pretty interesting to see if you end up chatting to any bike manufacturers off the back of this, because I think there's a serious amount of talent in what you've done here. I think it's amazing. If you've got any specific questions you want to post to David, let us know in the comments underneath, and we'll try and get David involved in the comments, basically. We'll see what we can pick out, because there's so much detail to this bike. I wouldn't even know where to begin, to be honest, so I need you to wade in, if that's cool.
That's cool, yeah.
Let us know what you think of the bike in the comments underneath, and see you in the next video.